Well, in a way, the question of the wild goes back to much earlier project of mine on Gothic monstrosity. And there I was already thinking about excessive forms of embodiment where the excess gets called something, horrific and monstrous, and then comes to represent forces and forms of being that a so-called human community, fears and wants to expel. So in a way, the return to wildness is a return to thinking about forms of embodiment that are excessive to the systems that we have for classification. And in many ways, I think the material that has been shoved under the heading of wild, particularly in a colonial context, are threatening forms of embodiment, whether those forms come as sexual formations or racial formations. Well, there are a number of bodies that are easily described as entering into discourse under the heading of wild, and I give a few definitions. There are bodies that seem to elude definition, and particularly at the end of the last century, the mania for classification that characterized large bodies of medical and psychiatric research really seemed to expect that every single form of embodiment could be accounted for, and could be described, and could enter into discourse under some fancy Greek Latinate name. But it turns out that there were as many exceptions as there were bodies that conform to the rule. And really, wildness is about those exceptions and about the way in which, as Pete Coviello put it in his book, there are untimely sexualities and forms of gender expression that simply do not emerge out of the conditions of classification of their era. What body comes to mind? As I say in the intro to the book, the wildness of the invert, for example, is, so it's so palpable that, in fact, in The Well of Loneliness, Radcliffe Hall has her main character, Stephen Gordon, say, what am I? Nature made me, but there must be a word for me. And that seeking out a vocabulary becomes the very mission of The Well of Loneliness. But interestingly, even with the category of invert, somehow the hero is not assuaged by entering into classification in that way. So what I'm suggesting, along with people like Pete Coviello, is that in any given era, there are people who are entered into discourse using terminologies that only roughly fit what they are. And at the same time, the category of wildness is just being used as a kind of catch-all for everything else. It's also being used as a way of expressing bodies that elude modern computation, modern forms of governance, colonial regimes of management. And therefore, you end up with a pretty interesting group of people and group of bodies that are being classified as wild at any given moment. And it's in that, margin to classification and rule that we find examples of wild identities, I guess, or wild anti-identities. Yeah, exactly. So Monkman is a very particular kind of artist. He understands the indigenous project to have been sort of co-opted by aesthetic modernism. And he literally paints his way out of that co-optation. And this is really important for this particular project that I lay out on wildness, because I propose that we have to kind of go through aesthetic modernism in order to make our way back into some relationship to wildness. And he does that. He literally, Monkman literally repaints modernist histories of art, but from the perspective of the indigenous subject, who is usually positioned in the painting or the ballet or the poem as just a very static other. And in Monkman's rendering, new visions of the world are inscribed from the perspective of those people who have been classified as wild. And so even in those paintings that now hang in the Met, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there's a vision of immigration and arrival in which Native people are hospitable, and they are, and you see white people with guns, and you see Native people trying to greet and trying to share and trying to open to. So these shifts in perspective change everything from the aesthetic mode of representation to an understanding of what these, these very familiar images are actually about. And so I use the category of bewilderment to talk about this counter-appropriative work that Monkman's art does. Well, that's the thing about reappropriating a slur like queerness. Like when you're still quite close to the historical moment in which a term signifies as a slur, the reworking of that word has a kind of power because it still stings when you hear it. But increasingly, queer has taken its place as an umbrella term, and some of the sting has gone out of it. And then, of course, there are all kinds of ways in which queer has really been seen as, in some ways, a colonial term that's being used the world over in place of other languages that might be used locally for talking about sexually eccentric, gender nonconforming bodies. So wild is not simply, a preferred term or an alternative term. It is a term, however, that speaks both to a past in which the colonial project was so dominant in sorting bodies, and in which certain kinds of gay bodies played their role, right? So I have that whole chapter on Roger Casement, who was somebody who was both doing supposedly humanitarian work on behalf of colonized peoples in the Congo and the Putumayo, but who was also happily engaged in all kinds of forms of sexual fetishism at the same time. So it's a restaging of what we've understood as a kind of heroic queer history. And then at the other end of the scale, as we enter into the 21st century, wildness allows us to think about certain forms of sexual classification and gendered embodiment in relationship to environmental politics too. So I feel like wildness has within it a kind of, there's a romantic function. I mean, who isn't interested in wild? Wild has a kind of rebellion that's built into it. But there is a historical use of that term that has to be accounted for on the one hand, and then there is a kind of environmental orientation of the term that forces us to position the human body in relationship to many other forces and systems of being. Well, honestly, Jonathan, that's always been my mode. I think one of the first reader reports I ever got for a book was, apart from the Gothic book, which had a kind of coherence to it, was the author needs to account for their archive. And there was a sense that I was just piling things together that didn't necessarily go together. And actually, Wild Things is a more, I hate to say this, but it's kind of a more disciplined book than some of the other texts that I've written, in the sense that, yes, I do leap between high and low, but I'm very conscious of the fact that in order to show the ways in which people have challenged the the inheritance of a certain kind of modernist aesthetic, we have to go through modernism. And I do my best to give an account of the way in which wildness is situated within literary and aesthetic modernism, and then begin the work of sort of pulling it apart. I'm less quick in this book to just simply jump to the championing of the low, and I try to stay with some really central texts of high culture, like T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, for example, to say that there's lots of material available to us in even conventional literary modernism if we read it in a kind of a skew way, if we read it through the lens of the bewildering challenges that have been made to modernism, rather than reading it straight. And I think in general, I'm trying to say that we need these wilder archives in order to interrupt what T.S. Eliot called the great tradition, where one white man hands off to the next in a long chain of associations. Those kinds of very neat genealogies inevitably stabilize cultural production, when what we should be doing is scrambling it. So I could see that my book could be seen as messy and confusing in some ways. And I guess I'm willing to own that, in the sense that there's a wildness to mess and a messiness to the wild that requires us to jump around in order to find different pieces of the project. The second book, however, because originally this was all one kind of massive book that went all the way into projects like Architecture, I decided at a certain point to split off this piece from what seemed to me like the second part of the book. And now I'm working on a project that is very much oriented to anarchist art movements of the 1970s, and that at the moment is called The Wild Beyond. Yeah, well, I wouldn't have expected that I would be writing about Rite of Spring, but when I began that chapter, it was the centenary of Rite of Spring, and I just couldn't, I couldn't sort of unhear it. It was everywhere, and I was really drawn in fact, to the music, and I thought, there's something so punk about this symphony. How did it end up being the centerpiece, on the one hand, of modernist high culture? And then as I looked further into the ballet in particular, I was like, this is a totally queer project, a queer collaborative project between Diaghilev, Nijinsky, and Stravinsky on the one hand. And then on the other hand, what is this kind of fascination with the folk cultures that form the central spine of its interest in the ritual, the fertility ritual that is the Rite of Spring? And so in the end, it became a perfect kind of hinge in the book for what you're saying is this kind of interesting connection between high and low, in the sense that you have a queer collaborative project that produces one of the central artifacts of modernist culture, but that has done so by completely absorbing indigenous influences and then spitting them out as noise, sound, broken form, awkward embodiment, and so on. And then to find out that Kent Monkman had done his own performance piece to a reworking of Rite of Spring made me realize that there was sort of more mileage in this than I had expected. And if you write about something like wildness, aesthetic wildness, there's no way to go around something like Rite of Spring, which was shocking to people because the sound making that it engaged rang to the bourgeois ears of the Parisian theater in 1913, sounded like noise, sounded like chaos, sounded like the world that colonial Europe had just sort of cordoned off under the heading of wild. And so there was again, there was no way around that. And going through it was actually deeply pleasurable. And that was one of my favorite chapters to write, even though I think it's, the least characteristic chapter for me in the book. Well, there are a few people. Um, I love Jordi Rosenberg's book, Actions of the Fox, which I engage in my book. I think it's a brilliant novel with its, erudite knowledge, fully showcased front and center, that has many, many different configurations of wildness and the undercommons within it. I think Saidiya Hartman, Wayward Girls, which is very much the book of the decade, if not the last 50 years, really reworks how we will write about bodies, gender, sexuality, race, and revolution. And, of course, I'm always reading and learning from Fred Moten, Tavia Nyong'o, my collaborator, on a special issue of South Atlantic Quarterly dedicated to wildness. His latest book on population is amazing. And, reading the work of young people like young scholars like Che Gossett on abolition has been fantastic this year. So I'm actually pretty optimistic about the state of, we could call it, I guess, post-queer studies in whichever direction that it may move. Queer studies that doesn't simply travel under the heading of queer, but might use categories like abolition, waywardness, wildness, undercommons. Those kinds of projects are what speak to me right now. And I think many of them are being written by young people. Rizvana Bradley's work on art is exemplary and incredible. So yeah, lots to read, lots to be excited about.